Hello, my name's Sean Brown from WiSen Innovation, and in this WiSen Quick Guide video series I'm going to show you how you can define a null, otherwise known as zero, reference data point from your baseline data. Now in this example process I'm going to focus in on a couple of nodes and probably only undertake the nulling of one node initially just to show you the process, and that node will be reference ID SAFT. So what we have here is a system operating on minute intervals. Forte and SAFT nodes are both installed on the same asset. The two horizontal axes that are in utilization are X and Y, and we know that by looking at the Z gravitational axis. We can see that the Z is near to 1, which indicates that axis is not in utilization, it's not active. Now the next process will be go to setup, node offset. We scroll down to the type of node, and we can see here that I'm going to refer to them as reference IDs, and the one I'm going to just undertake the baselining is for SAFT. Now when you're at this stage you can obviously tick a multitude of nodes, and you can obviously do a multitude of attributes. Now the way I typically undertake this is I would undertake those nodes on the same asset, and I would typically do one axis at a time, or you can do both axes at the same time, but the important thing is that you split them up so you're doing them per asset, on the knowledge that each asset can potentially behave differently, or each facade on an asset, for example. So it's breaking these down into manageable processes is the easiest solution. So as I mentioned, I'm just going to utilize SAFT, and I'm going to do the X and the Y together. Next step will be to press add offset. And as we've got quite a bit of data to display, it takes a little while to load the screen. So automatically you have a review screen where the time period is 1 day or 24 hours. And it's now up to the user to obviously define the period of time for which they would like to apply the offset for their data. Now if this was 3 months of data, you'd obviously go back and change that time period to display the whole data range. But within that 3 months, you might decide to only use a proportion of that data to define the null, the zero reference point. So this is completely kind of user controlled. Now for the purpose of this video, this training video, I'm just going to display a couple of days of data. So I'm going to go back to the 15th, select the date, and press OK. And we press plot. So what you'll be presented with is obviously the data of that time range, and the reason for having a baseline period is to essentially try and capture seasonal variations or temperature variations that can affect the asset and the tilt meter. So obviously this example here is only the last couple of days, but what we're seeing is the temperature variance between night and day, and if I was to plot this independently versus temperature, we would see those delta changes. This top graphical display is the x-axis, and down below we have the y. So just focus on the x first of all. You're essentially selecting the data that you wish to offset first. Now because this is a dense reading interval or t interval of 1 minute, I'm finding it difficult obviously to select a defined point. So we have the ability here to press the horizontal axis, zoom in, we hold down the left mouse button and we drag this across to the left. And release. So now it's easier to select a defined point. So if we right click on the data, we can add this as a start point. And to revert to the previous graph, because we're looking to now define an endpoint over the data range, if we press restore, this then presents the previous graphical display. And again, as I cannot select a definitive point at the end of my data, I'm going to press the horizontal axis, zoom in, hold the left mouse button down and drag this across the data which I wish to review. So the important thing here is that you're applying an offset and you're wanting this to be applicable to the future data. So when you're selecting the data, it's important that not all the data is selected. So here I'm just going to leave the data selected short. I'm going to add this as an endpoint. As I mentioned, it's an endpoint and apply to future. So therefore the offset I'm about to apply, I want that offset to be applied to future data which is collected. If I was just to use endpoint only, then this would just be an offset in the past, and obviously the next most current data going forward will be at the same arbitrary value we see on the screen at the moment. So endpoint and apply to future. And again, we press restore and we go back to the previous graphical representation. Okay, that concludes the selection of the data. And the next process will be to place the mouse over any of the data that's been selected in red and to right click. So you can see now we've got a lot more options now in display, and what we'd be going to next is the advanced offset. So it's got a lot more calculation tools available to us. If for instance you were going to be putting this to a 0 point and there was a specific point within that graphical representation that you're happy to utilize, you have the ability to right click on a defined point in the graph, and where it says current point to and it has 0, obviously press apply. That will then offset the data using a defined user selected point. Whereas the advanced offset, as I mentioned, has a lot more mathematical analysis tools. And what this has done over the selected data range has automatically calculated an average current resultant value. So obviously it knows that through the pre-selected data, If you are not looking to utilize average, because obviously average can take into account any outlier data, then you have the capability or the option to right click on the graph, and obviously you can focus in on the start point here if it's important. But you can see that we can set the current resultant value using different mathematical equations, or we can define a maximum, a minimum, or we can define a specific point, or we can actually type in a customized value. Now my preference is a median, so if I go to median, and what I'm saying here is over this data range I would like to set my median value as the start point here, and you can see that between T1 and T1 comma, which so happens to be the same endpoint, we have a current resultant value calculated. So we don't need to redefine the endpoint. If, for instance, you didn't want to use any noisy data or data you don't agree with, you obviously can have the capability to right click on a point here and define this as the median endpoint, for example, like so. And then what will happen automatically is the T1 comma value will change to the point selected and the value should be updated. Now the next step, and it kind of implies why I said you do not select all the data initially, is you need a target resultant value, and that can only be accomplished by selecting a blue point. Now at the end of the selected point, or the most current value should I say, I have a blue point. Now I know that if I right click on the point, as opposed to it saying current resultant value, you can see the words have come up saying target resultant value. So what you're doing here is, for the calculated current resultant value, what would you like this to become? So it's typical on a baseline on a job that the null, or 0 as we're going to determine it here, reference value, is set, and to do this is a customized value, so it's automatically carried through 0 because that's the most common number. You can obviously change this to an absolute number. For example, if this was a crap meter, you might define the start value to be 10 millimeters. But here I'd like to use a 0 point, and C is calculated the relative offset that's going to be applied going forward. We've finished this step and we press confirm. And we come back through to the main box, and we can see this blue box here, which means the task is complete. So if we had a multitude of serial numbers selected, then obviously you have the opportunity now with this little A button, which means apply to other nodes. Now bearing in mind we haven't applied this to the y-axis yet, and you also have the capability to press the plus button and to mirror the independent way of setting the null over that time period. Or if you're happy to use the identical start and end point and you're confident that the data is a clean data set to be utilized, then obviously you can proceed without reviewing the graphical representation. But the important thing here is that if you're applying it to another node or another axis, to press the A button, so you can see here that if multiple nodes were selected, this would be a larger pop-up box showing the multitude of reference IDs or serial numbers. And as I've only got the y-axis to define, then if I click this, I click confirm, and confirm to apply or to multi-apply, you can see on the y-axis that I've also got an offset period defined, and obviously that's got a different current resultant value calculated. So again, that's a median value, much the same as the x-axis. Obviously that value, that arbitrary value, is different, but the time range is the same. So the next step would be you could press preview and just kind of review the offset that's about to be applied. I'm quite happy with the process that I've undertaken here, so I'm going to press the node offset update. We have another confirm that you're happy with everything you've undertaken. We go back to the main selection screen, and as you can see here, an offsetting progress bar. So the duration for the offsetting depends on obviously the quantity of data over that time period. So I've only selected a couple of days. You can see that the bar's updating, so the process is relatively quick. We'll give this a moment. Process is completed, and if you want to review to ensure everything is complete, then you can see here the top row we've offsetted and we've applied to the future, and if we press the details we can review any specific information. So this is a history log of what's undertaken. The kind of final review, I suppose, will be just to look at the table. So whereas the table initially at the start of this video was showing an arbitrary value for the SAFT ID, then if we look at the X and the Y value here, these have been offset so that the null reference value was defined over that time period. And obviously what we're seeing here is the difference to the null for the median value that was defined. So obviously we're not going to have that specifically at a 0. You have defined this associated to a median. So this concludes the process for defining a null reference point over a baseline data period.